pleasure to see you today. My name is Paul Pangaro. I'm professor of the practice in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute, known as the HCII. It's part of the School of Computer Science at Carnegie Mellon. And along with the HCII and the Tepper School of Business, we've created Enable, which is a retail and services collaborative. Some of you may know this, but just a brief intro for those who are new. Our mission is to create humane, efficient, and positive retail and service experiences. So it's that specific focus. And of course, we're completely focused on advances in technology, but we understand that advances in technology must come with advances in interaction design, service design, and ultimately organizational design. So all of these are required to successfully adopt a new technology. So this combination of design and technology in a single initiative in Enable, we feel is unique. And we're very glad to have you all with us today. We invite your questions and comments. You can find us at cmu.edu/enable, E-N-A-I-B-L-E. Just a few logistics, and then we'll get to the fun part. Today's talk, of course, is designing effective human AI collaborations. And I'm looking forward to getting into it with my colleague here, Ken Holstein, and I'll introduce him in a minute. So, logistics. The event is on the record and is being recorded. If you'd like to pose a question today, we're going to use the normal chat function on Zoom. We haven't tried this before, so we're looking forward to the disorder that it may bring. So you're familiar, I suspect, with the chat button on the bottom of the Zoom screen. You might also raise your hand, and we'll do our best to get to questions that way. We do want to generate conversation, because one of the tenets of Enable is not just to push out information, but quite the reverse, to engage the community in conversations, the technology community, the CMU community broadly, and the retail and services community at all levels. So I think you'll get a taste of that today. So by way of structure, I'll introduce the topic and our speaker more formally. We'll have a conversation, and then we'll capture your chat questions as best we can, and then bring you to live speaking if we can work on that. So here we are. You've all read from the description this AI thing, this juggernaut of technology that's everywhere. It's obviously here to stay, not just in everyday life of individuals, but with all its pros and cons in business. And AI systems increasingly are used to augment human decision-making in complex work contexts. We're sure you know of some of these, and we hope to expand those ideas to more possibilities for you today, those of you who are in industry. And of course, augmenting human decision-making comes with a promise. Let me add the hope, the desire, the need to overcome human limitations and biases while not introducing the limitations and biases of the machine. So this idea of bringing these two things together, the human and the machine, goes back at least to the 1940s with Norbert Wiener and cybernetics. In the 1950s, J.C.R. Licklider, who's at MIT for many years, coined the word symbiosis in this context. Dung Engelbart in the 60s, etc. We could go on and on about the history. But this goal of a rich symbiosis, of taking advantage of each to augment the human intelligence with what the machines do well and not supplant what humans do well with machines doing it less well. This is now much more exciting than it was 10 years ago. And we know why. It's the explosion of data that's come from the internet and the computation power from hardware. And so there's a renaissance of this idea of human and machine symbiosis. But let's be specific. That's too broad a context. We want to bring it down to today, designing effective human AI collaborations for retail and services. How can we combine the complementary strengths of human and AI judgment in practice while mitigating the limitations of each? And for this, we have an absolutely perfect speaker, wonderful colleague of mine, Ken Holstein. Ken is assistant professor also in the Human-Computer Interaction Institute, who's hosting Enable today along with Tepper School of Business. Ken, I'd love to keep this on a personal level, especially since we're talking so much about machines. Can you give a little intro about your background and interests, and then why this topic is of specific interest to you, importance to you? Ken, you're muted. Trying to unmute. There we go.
Oh, there we go. Yeah, I was stuck on mute for a little bit. Yeah, sure. So started out, at least in research in cognitive science, cognitive psychology, and particularly interested in studying some capabilities that humans have that at least modern machine learning systems at the time, and honestly still today, can't come close to matching, including in terms of inferences that humans can make about the causal world, the causal structure of the world, inferences that humans can make about other humans, social inferences from often very little evidence. And so started out there in kind of more basic research in psychology, then moved a little bit more towards machine learning, and then ultimately found a space in human-computer interaction as a field where I could do a bit of both and continue to investigate some of these questions about complementary strengths of humans and AI systems, but from more of a design lens, actively designing and building systems in real-world contexts, not just in laboratory settings, as in the original kind of psychology directions I've been exploring. So that's, in short, kind of how I got interested in this area.
It's a rich background, and I can see now more why you bring about the points of view that you bring about, which I'm anxious to get into talking about today. How should we get into that? Shall you have a few slides perhaps, and then we'll open from there.
Yeah, let me go ahead and share my slides.
Great.
All right, the obligatory question, can you see my slides?
We can.
All right, great. So today, as Paul said, thank you so much for the great introduction, Paul, is focused, we're hoping mostly on conversation. And we're especially interested in chatting with those from industry settings as well to learn a bit more about you. This isn't just about us kind of sharing some of the research we're doing at CMU, but we really want to hear about some of the challenges you're facing, initiatives you may be working on, questions you may have from retail and service settings and industry. So I'm going to keep this relatively brief. Please do feel free to raise your hand and ask questions throughout. So I'm just going to provide a quick overview of research in our group here at Carnegie Mellon, which is called the Koala Lab. And koala, in addition to being a very cute animal, is short for co-augmentation, learning, and AI. So broadly, we study how humans and AI systems can augment each other's abilities and learn from each other over time to support more effective and responsible forms of human-AI collaboration. And right now, we have three broad focus areas in the lab, which I'll summarize in the next few minutes, although of course we can chat more afterwards. So first, a major focus area is studying today how AI tools are augmenting worker practices in various work settings. And we're building on this knowledge to develop systems that can better combine complementary strengths of humans and AI in practice, once we understand what these complementary strengths are in each setting. And so in many of our ongoing projects to do this work, we partner with organizations in industry, in the public sector, and so on, that are already using AI systems at various points in the journey. They may just be at the point of considering adopting AI systems. They may be at a point where for multiple years now, they've had some form of human AI collaborative work going, but now they have questions such as, how well is it going? How do we effectively evaluate the quality of human AI decision-making? And so these settings span, for example, high-stakes impactful decisions in contexts like social work and healthcare, design, content moderation, and so on. So many of these contexts are frontline work settings where humans have a lot of rich access to contextual information, conversations with other people that the AI machine learning systems alone would not be able to replicate, although they may be able to provide some complementary information and insights. So to give one concrete example of our approach, in one project, we're studying how social workers in the United States are currently making use of AI-based decision support in their day-to-day work. And this is an area that the ACLU has actually released a recent report. These sorts of systems are relatively new in the past decade, but seem to be quickly spreading across the United States. They're now implemented in several states, with various states currently in consultation trying to explore what forms of human AI decision-making they might want to try incorporating and whether they do want to move forward in this direction at all. So this is one example of a high-stakes work context where increasingly AI tools are being used to augment and guide worker decision-making. But there's really still a lot to learn about how this actually plays out in practice. So to investigate, we visit government agencies in the US and conduct detailed observations of the ways in which social workers are actually working with these tools day to day at different decision points. For example, how do they make sense of the AI's predictions? How do they then integrate these predictions into their decision-making processes? And how do organizational pressures and incentives influence the way that workers choose to use or not use AI, right? Because these decisions aren't made in a vacuum. They're made within an organizational context, and the messaging around these AI systems can really influence human AI collaboration, what that looks like on the ground. So then, building on our understanding of their work practices, we're now working with social workers to continue with this running example to collaboratively reimagine how AI systems might better support their work in the future, based often on their experiences, maybe years of experience using AI systems day to day. And we then work with them to try to collaboratively design interventions that can help them make more effective use of existing AI systems today. So this includes developing new training technologies that can prepare workers for effective human AI collaborative work. We're also exploring the design of new kinds of decision support interfaces that can help workers in the moment, at the point of decision making, more effectively integrate AI predictions with their own expert judgment. And finally, we're exploring opportunities to more fundamentally improve the underlying AI models, better optimizing these models for effective collaboration with humans, as well as opportunities to more radically re-envision the role of AI in their work. So to say a bit more about this first direction, across a wide range of workplace contexts, we found that AI tools are often introduced without adequate onboarding and training for workers who will use them day to day. And really, this seems to be a surprisingly common failure mode that we see with systems that have been deployed for a bit longer, for a few years so far, for example. So in some of our projects, we're focusing on the development of new interactive training tools to help professionals rapidly and efficiently learn how to collaborate with AI more effectively. For example, by giving workers low stakes opportunities to practice making AI-assisted decisions while receiving immediate feedback on their decision making, some signal about their decision quality to help them improve, or at least to reflect on how they're incorporating AI recommendations into their decisions. And we also focus on helping workers hone their mental models of the AI system itself, especially the AI system's capabilities and its limitations in relation to their own capabilities and limitations and potential biases as human experts. And so in this example shown here, again, sticking with this running example of the social work case, this is a case where the system used by the social workers, which is called the AFST, workers can, before they actually get out into the field using these systems, have an opportunity to make their own judgments, practice incorporating or not incorporating AI outputs into their decisions, justify or reflect upon and write a brief explanation for others of why they're making the decision they are, whether that is aligning more closely with the AI output or diverging. and then potentially receive feedback on what other social workers have done, especially workers with more years of experience in completing this task. So in a related set of projects, we're taking a look at the interfaces that workers currently have to AI predictions or recommendations. And we're exploring ways to improve human-AI collaborations by redesigning or extending these interfaces. So for example, in many contexts where AI-based decision support is used today, we found that workers are currently provided relatively little information about how an AI system works, what data it uses, and importantly, how exactly it might be expected, or might in some cases not be expected, to complement their own judgment and their own abilities as humans. So in some cases, like in the example shown here, workers may simply be provided with a probability of an outcome or a numerical risk score, a number, as shown in this example, which again is from this system in the social work context. So one of the directions that we're exploring across multiple domains is designing interfaces that in real time can prompt people to reflect productively on complementary abilities between themselves and AI-based decision supports. For example, what information and context does a human worker have, but which the AI can't see, or even if it can see the information, can't fully understand in the way that a human with knowledge of the social context might be able to. And what information on the flip side does the AI have, which the human can't see or easily process? So we're currently conducting experiments and exploring various forms of interface design interventions to try to understand the impacts that these kinds of interfaces have on human AI collaborative decision-making in practice, both through smaller scale experiments where we bring people into the lab, but also in various real-world work settings where our ultimate goal is to actually improve interfaces deployed by organizations today.
Can you go back just a second?
Yeah, sure.
Out for a second. So normally you only get the color bar and it gives you a number. But here in two different cases, the AI is actually providing an explanation that aids the worker to, how would you finish that sentence?
Yeah, in this particular example shown here, I would say aids the worker in reflecting on information that they may have informed a judgment they might have made already, even before seeing the AI prediction, that might genuinely be pointing them in a better direction than the AI. Perhaps the right thing to do is to disregard the AI prediction in a particular case because the human has access to some of this information. And on the other side here, also helping a worker reflect on information that they don't have ready access to, that the AI might have been taking into account. And then there are options here in this interface to learn more, for example, about how the AI is taking that information into account and how it might be guiding the AI towards this particular recommendation.
So I'm hearing there's a beautiful balance here in these two cases. The AI is not just saying, hey, you missed something, but rather you may have missed something, but there's a complement to that, which is that you took into account something that the AI did not. Am I correct in that way of saying it?
Absolutely. In a lot of these settings, again, AI is imperfect. Humans are imperfect, often in different ways, although sometimes in the same way. We want the conversation between humans and AI to be much more, less one, as you said, of, hey, you may have missed something, and much more of, you may have missed something. I may also have missed something, and to reflect on both sides.
Great, thank you.
In many of these contexts.
Thank you for correcting my attribution of a particular tone to your interface. The tone is extremely important. But what I love about this, which I think is new, having been interested in looking at AI for some time, is there's not the presumption that you keep AI behind the black curtain and the results poke out and that's it. You accept the results or you refuse it. It's a bit like recommendation engines today, right? AI says, right, would you like to listen to this? But there's no conversation. So here you're piercing that barrier and you're opening it up to conversation, but also to the pros and the cons, not just, hey, the AI was smart about something, but the human was perhaps smarter. Again, you should correct my language if you don't agree with it. So the idea that the interaction design is explicating the positives and the potential limitations of the AI is constantly renewing my trust that the designers of this thing are not pulling something over on me, but rather always wanting to be transparent.
Absolutely. And this sort of direction relates very strongly to some directions in the field, like explainability, explainable, or interpretable, or intelligible, many names, AI. And I think in this direction in particular, the sorts of conversations that we're really interested in facilitating go one step beyond explainable AI. It's an explanation that's also grounded in information that humans might be considering. So in other words, opening up the black box a bit, but also holding up a mirror to the human and enabling some form of contrasting of the ways that the human might have arrived at their judgment versus the ways that the AI might have arrived at their judgment.
Balancing, not privileging.
Right. And giving some agency then to the workers to decide which to privilege.
Man, maybe that's the most important of all, giving the worker agency. Thank you. Great. Absolutely. Thanks for that. Allowing me to interrupt.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, and I'll briefly mention, just because I've been running with the social work example quite a bit so far, we're also conducting these sorts of explorations in various other contexts where humans and AI systems currently work together to make predictions and decisions. And again, often in these contexts where humans are working on the front lines or close to them, and so have access to a lot of relevant contextual information that AI systems may be missing. So here's just another example where humans receive assistance from an AI model when predicting the value of a home, and they need to decide, again, how much to trust or rely upon the model prediction in a given instance. And so there are a lot of open questions here about how best to support people in making these sorts of decisions, calibrating their own trust and reliance. So to give an example of another project direction, especially since I've been talking a lot so far about decisions where people might be making fairly closed-ended, although in very complex contexts, fairly closed-ended decisions, yes, no decisions, screen in a case for further investigation in the social work case, or screen it out, or what's the level of risk. To contrast with that a bit, I'll also share that we're studying some more open-ended domains. And this is an example of a very open-ended setting. So here we have some active projects studying how human designers work with AI tools, emerging AI tools, to co-create new designs. So we want to understand here how product designers learn to work with both existing and emerging AI design tools to potentially accomplish design tasks that neither human designers nor AI systems could accomplish on their own. And so building on this understanding, our goal is then to design, build, and prototype a wide range of novel interfaces going beyond the state of the art that support human AI co-creation, and also human AI learning. So in this project, we're beginning to explore multiple forms or levels of potential collaboration between designers and AI agents, ranging, as you can see here in this diagram, from modes of interaction where designers largely use AI as tools to help them achieve goals that they specify entirely by themselves, but also exploring some richer modes of potential interaction where designers and AI might actually collaboratively negotiate and iterate upon the design goals, as well as the means by which to achieve these goals. And so we're currently exploring this in the context of a few contexts, computer-aided design, where various existing, for example, generative AI tools are being developed and put out there, integrated into tools that are widely used. But we're also exploring it in emerging design areas. So one example is morphing or self-folding materials, which my colleague here at the HCAI, Lining Yao, works on quite a bit, and she's collaborating on this project. And so some of these emerging design tasks we're finding really push against the cognitive limitations of human designers working alone. So there's a lot of potential there for human AI collaboration to help, but also a lot of questions about how exactly that human AI collaboration might help versus making the designer feel that they're losing too much agency, creative control, or losing important parts of the design and creative process that really would be a shame to lose.
Ken,
yeah.
Before you move on, Lisa had a question in the chat, which you might have answered partly, which is, what's an example of a design that a human cannot create on their own? Is it really just beyond the realm of possibility, or does the machine save time or bring other features to the conversation? How would you answer?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And the cannot piece, I wouldn't necessarily say that we're strictly focused on, well, we're not strictly focused on cases that we think humans can, under no circumstances, design on their own. There are tasks that can be quite difficult for humans. So actually going back to the example that I just mentioned, looking at some of these emerging design tasks, one of them, and Lining Yao, another faculty member here at CMU, works a lot in this area and has been pioneering in the space, self-folding materials. In other words, one example would be furniture that is packable and shippable in an extremely compact form. And then once delivered to its location and unboxed, there's some mechanism for it to fold itself into its final form. And so this is an example where forms of AI-based simulation can help the designer understand how to design the material in essentially multiple forms, where the material may evolve over time under different conditions for this sort of self-folding mechanism.
Good. Could I jump in, Ken? Another example to answer Lisa's question is the idea that in design conversations, a single mind is perhaps not as fertile as multiple minds. It's an old idea about variety and diversity in the conversation. These diagrams actually derive from some work in a lab at MIT. Actually, they were made prominent in a lab at MIT called the Architecture Machine Group, in which the idea was that a human and a computer could talk about design. And these models derive from the work of conversation theory that were part of that lab's influence. So the general case, to answer Lisa's a little bit, is it's not about, as you said too, Ken, it's not about doing something that humans cannot do, but doing something better that a single human or even a single design team within the limitations of the heads that are in that team, and expanding that against symbiosis. What can the machine bring to it? But the important thing to say is the computer is not just giving you 3D renderings in the case of architecture or deciding on the strength of a beam. It's actually talking about the goals of the design. And that's a fundamentally new kind of co-creation where there's a kind of co-equal or almost equality. There are strengths on each side. I couldn't help but mention that because there are a number of examples from architecture and design in answer to Lisa's question. So,
yeah, no, thank you for jumping in. And yeah, some other collaborators I've listed down here, like Frederick Gemeiner and Nick Martellero, we're very interested in interfaces, for example, just to illustrate some of these options that are shown here towards the right, interfaces that mostly interact with designers by asking questions, for example, rather than making recommendations. So that's one possible mode of interaction to support what we're referring to here as negotiation. Reflection questions that might push designers to reconsider whether they've properly specified their objectives for a design, whether they've considered certain edge cases would be another example, or just to push them outside of maybe a strong fixation on a particular design solution. Great. Any other questions at this point, or would it make sense to move
There
on?
might be some to come, but I would keep going. I think they'll fit more to where you're going than where we are. Please keep going, Ken.
Sounds good. Great. Yeah. So earlier I mentioned that the Koala Lab's current research spans 3 major themes. And although our discussion today is largely about this first one on studying and supporting effective human AI collaborations, there's a lot of overlap across these themes. They're really not mutually independent. So in the next minute or so, I'll give you a quick overview of some of the directions we're working on under themes 2 and 3, in case any spark the interest of those in this audience.
Good.
So a second focus area in the lab is the development of new kinds of design and prototyping methods with the goal of empowering diverse stakeholders to shape the behavior of AI systems that impact their lives. And we're ultimately interested in exploring ways to facilitate more meaningful involvement from various stakeholders across the entire AI development lifecycle, where one representation of this is shown here. So ranging from problem formulation, what problems is the AI system meant to solve in the first place, and task definition and operationalization, to data set construction, model definition, all the way to model evaluation, deployment, and monitoring in deployment. So for example, some of the questions that we're currently asking in this space include, as I mentioned, how we can better engage relevant stakeholders, including populations who might be impacted by an AI system, such as a public algorithmic system deployed by a city. That would be one example. An AI system deployed in an educational setting, or in a workplace setting, as mentioned earlier with the social work example. Another question we've been asking and exploring is how we can construct meaningful quality measures and KPIs for human AI collaborative decision-making. And so if we're focusing on the outcomes of decision-making, oftentimes this might look identical to quality measures for human decision-making or fully automated decision-making. If we're looking at process, we might have additional specialized KPIs for human AI collaborative decision-making. And finally, a major area of interest for us is how we can help product teams to more effectively prototype new AI systems. And so this is really still an active area of research. By and large, this space is still the Wild West compared to prototyping and design for other types of systems. There are a lot of open questions here. And in working with some of our industry partners, we've observed a lot of challenges in this space where new methods might be helpful. So finally, a third focus area in the lab is supporting AI fairness efforts in practice, whether in industry product settings or in the public sector. And so here, we're working to design and evaluate new tools and methods that can help machine learning practitioners assess and address unfairness in the systems that they design and develop. We've interviewed a range of industry product teams to try to better understand the challenges that they are currently facing in this area and the reasons why existing internal AI fairness efforts often end up failing in practice along various dimensions. So for example, to address some of these challenges, one of our projects is focusing on creating and evaluating a new collective auditing platform, which enlists the help of end users, volunteers, and crowd workers in auditing the AI products and services. And so our goals here are to empower everyday users of algorithmic systems to surface, identify unfair, biased, or otherwise harmful algorithmic behaviors to product teams as early as possible in the design, development, deployment process. And of course, also to support product teams in identifying these and taking action accordingly. So I'll mention briefly, beyond our discussion here today, there are a lot of ways to engage with our lab. For example, if any of the broad project directions or specific projects that I've mentioned so far spark your interest, or if you're interested in collaborating with the lab on related directions, please do feel free to reach out and get in touch. All right, thank you.
Great, Ken. Thanks so much. Just as an initial sweep of the slides, I think that sets a lot of context. We do have a question that's quite related, I think, to where you just were. Roy asks, whatever your AI system may be, how do you validate it or ensure its dependability? How good does it have to be? And however good it has to be, how do you arrive at that level of goodness? This is a very tiered question from Roy.
Yeah, that's a great question. A lot of really fundamental questions here. So, I mean, I think one, in a lot of contexts, real world contexts that we've worked in, one of the initial big challenges, even if a system has already been designed, developed, and deployed, is thinking deeply about what good means in the first place. So this is an area where we actually see a lot of tension, even though it seems like such a fundamental thing. It appears to be quite hard in practice. So this kind of gets back to a few slides ago, I mentioned this idea of KPIs for human AI collaborative decision quality. In essence, what does success look like? And for oftentimes there are some value misalignments across different stakeholders. So it can be fairly difficult to get right. But for the moment, if we assume that we have figured out at least an initial metric of success, multiple ways to validate it from that point on. I mean, one way is kind of traditionally from a machine learning perspective, just looking at standard metrics of accuracy on different subgroups. In other words, these are evaluations of the AI system's performance on historical data. Another could be evaluations of an AI system in the field. A lot of the systems that I'm talking about today, that I've been talking about, are really systems where humans and AI are jointly making decisions. And there can be multiple configurations of that. For example, in the social work context, we have an AI system that is trying to assist human decision-making, providing some information through an interface to the human, and the human makes the final decision. And there are other configurations as well. For example, cases where the system might be largely autonomous, and a human jumps in and can override decisions or provide additional information to the AI system to inform or change or contest some of the decisions that would have been made otherwise without that human intervention. And so in those cases, to validate it, typically I would recommend an empirical approach in which you are actually collecting data on both the process and the outcomes of those decisions, and then trying to evaluate what is actually happening, rather than simply relying upon historical data.
Great. So another question is, if companies are interested in exploring these opportunities that you're talking about, how do you recognize what a promising approach might be? Or how do you, and on the other side of it, how do you look inside the business and say, oh, that's something that AI might help with? So these are the complementary questions. How do you get started, I guess, is a better way to ask the question.
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. And I'd love to keep talking about this if there are people in the room as well who are genuinely kind of interested in exploring implementing some form of human AI collaborative approach. I think one answer to start with, a way perhaps not to get started, I would say, is to start with the goal of we need more AI. Lots of companies are implementing AI. Let's find a place to squeeze in AI. I think this really relates, I think, to what we were just talking about in terms of defining success metrics. For example, if we have some form of human AI collaboration to improve decision quality, actually maybe establishing through data analyses or having otherwise good reason to believe that there is some specific area for improvement in existing human decision processes, or on the flip side, in existing automated decision processes. You could come at this from both directions, and a company may have a fully human, fully automated approach, and looking for some of those gaps and starting there, and then matchmaking it and trying to see whether there seems to be real potential for not fully human or not fully automated approach would be kind of my high level answer. I am curious there whether I've fully answered the question though, or whether there's more you're interested in learning.
Well, we would invite those who ask the questions to keep going, and please raise your hand or type in the chat. We'd like to keep going. I think a corollary question to that, Ken, is for those implementations that you've seen that have been successful, what were the lessons learned? Is there any way to generalize that?
Yeah, and I think in a lot of modern day cases, there's definitely always room for improvement. So in a lot of our projects, we're looking at those areas for improvement. But definitely there are spots of success. So yeah, actually, can you repeat the question for?
So from what you've seen in implementations, or even in the exploration of desiring implementations, what were the lessons learned? Were specific mistakes made? I mean, in a sense, earlier you said one would be, don't start by saying we got to have some AI here, right? So there may be more of that class.
Yeah, I mean, another very common one that we've seen, probably in the majority of settings actually that we've studied, are ones in which the workers feel that the AI has been thrust upon them, and feel that those implementing the AI or those within the organization are ultimately interested in moving towards automating away their roles. That's one possible example, which isn't the ideal message to get across to your workers, especially if the goal genuinely is to augment human abilities to support workers, which in some of these cases, that is actually the true motivation. And yet, ultimately, that doesn't get across to the workers themselves, which creates really severe undertrust and even anger around the deployment of the AI system, which is not the foundation for any form of collaboration, any notion of collaboration. So that's one case. Another is, as I mentioned earlier, we've often seen a lack of what we would consider to be adequate training, and this is so important. In some cases, we'll see workers don't actually, even if they've been using the system for quite a while, have a clear sense of how the system was intended to augment their abilities, what the purpose of the system is, or the KPIs that maybe designers and management might have knowledge of that the AI is supposed to help them move towards. That's also not transparent to them. So this is kind of some breakdowns in transparency and communication around the AI system. This isn't entirely about explainability. This is also kind of more broadly about the reasons why the AI system is being deployed, the motivations of the humans who are involved in deploying it, in introducing it or trying this experiment. Because oftentimes, at least at this phase, it may be a sort of experiment. And so the issue can often be workers essentially being treated as test subjects rather than participants in that experiment.
Yes, classic clash in any design situation where you need to bring the co-participation in rather than use people as subjects in the context of bringing about a new kind of interactivity. There's a couple of direct messages here and a bit of a follow-on. One question is, following on, what industry or application do you think could benefit from more AI? And then there's the opposite, where should it be pared back? One thing in the context, of course, of in retail and service is when people are engaging with people. So if sales associates and customers are in stores, is there a way to enhance that with AI? Certainly in training, you've touched on that. I'm not trying to steal your thunder, but I'd like to get to the more interesting applications. And of course, in phone support, when people call in, there's very often an AI helping the person on the phone to make suggestions and so on. But are there other people-to-people engagements or other applications in general that you think for a given industry would benefit from this symbiosis?
Yeah. So I like that framing of placing bets on where should we perhaps have more AI, at least if well designed, and maybe be paired back. Yeah. So I think my answer will probably be should be understood in the context of existing AI systems. It's possible that in the future we'll have a new class of AI systems with different capabilities and limitations. But I would say more AI can definitely be helpful in cases where workers are, this is kind of a common answer in this area, workers are currently spending a great deal of time on tasks that they're not actually particularly well suited to, that they don't find a great degree of fulfillment in. I think it can be pared back quite a bit in tasks that involve direct social interaction with humans. And also, there are a lot of applications of AI out there to some extent, including like the social work context that I was talking about before, where there are enormous risks to using AI, also potential benefits. Making inferences about other people based on historical data, you can very, very easily run into issues of historical bias, for example, where the AI is trained to predict proxies for the outcomes that we really care about. And this is a pretty common scenario, given the sorts of data that is often available to train AI systems, predictive analytic systems, risk scoring systems, where ultimately the AI is trained to predict historical decisions from human decision makers. An example in the social work context that I've been mentioning would be, rather than being able to directly predict the degree to which a child is at risk of harm, rather predicting the likelihood that a family will be investigated for child abuse. And these are not the same thing. There's great documented potential for human bias in decisions about which family to investigate that do not correlate perfectly with which families, where there's an actual risk of harm. And so there, I think this is an area where there are a lot of open questions for human AI complementarity, because again, here we're talking about risk due to human bias in the first place that can get amplified by AI systems, and the possibility that within a human AI collaborative setting, if designed a certain way, that these risks may simply be amplified, these biases may be propagated through the AI's recommendations. There's also some potential, and we've seen some of this in our research, for nonetheless, for humans to reduce biases in algorithmic decisions, even if the AI systems were trained originally on human decisions. There's potential there for some form of mutual mitigation of what would otherwise be harmful biases in AI decision-making or human decision-making alone. And so that's trying to foster that is something that we're very interested in.
Great. I just see that there was a question in the chat that scrolled off the screen, great user experience, that I should have brought up earlier, but I'm only just seeing it. It's a little bit cast in a technical way, but let me paraphrase it. When we say AI here, what is the scope of technology that you're talking about?
Yeah, that's a really great question. And that's a good question to be asking, I think, in any context where the term AI comes up, just because the scope is enormous. So I'm talking broadly about statistical machine learning systems primarily. I won't say purely statistical machine learning systems. Sometimes systems in deployment in some of these settings are really a mixture of maybe rule-based expert systems with some machine learning components. They're really systems composed, not just of a single model or algorithm, but multiple chained together and working in concert, with one feeding its outputs into the next as the next model's inputs. Yeah.
Is there an application of AI that you didn't see coming, but you're glad to see in use? This is from Lisa again. She asks tough questions.
Yeah, no, I really, that's a great question. Yeah, definitely. I would say in general, if you haven't gotten this already, I vacillate very much between excitement about the benefits of AI, concerns about the risks. And so that's why a lot of our research is so focused on trying to get to some good middle space, some good combinations of human judgment and strengths and machine. Mm-hmm. I would actually say one area where I've long been skeptical about the role of AI is in creative tasks. So that's an area that's newer to me. I've spent more time working in settings where AI is being used as some form of decision support for humans in more closed-ended tasks, where, again, like the social work context, healthcare, similarly, that making supporting diagnoses from healthcare professionals. And so for some of these more open-ended creative tasks, I think I've opened up to this a lot more after getting more familiar with the literature, getting more familiar with human AI co-creative tools. Not necessarily that I'm always blown away by existing tools, but rather that I see a lot more potential for AI systems to help potentially even in relatively simple ways. And I guess one example of what I'm calling simple, maybe it's not truly simple from a technical perspective on the back end, but it could be an AI system largely staying quiet in the background, waiting for moments when an individual designer is working and asking some of these questions or promoting certain forms of reflection, these really light touch interventions that might help a designer get unstuck or question some of their fundamental assumptions in context, for example, where other human design collaborators aren't currently available would be one use case.
Great, I think that's a wonderful answer to end on. We'll do a little bit of a close here. Thanks everyone for attending. If you want to apply this conversation to your company, new and current Enable sponsors would be invited to follow-up discussion with Ken and members of the Koala Lab. If you're interested, please get in touch with us about that. A couple of logistics very quickly. We'll take a short break over the holidays, of course. Enjoy the holidays, everyone. But on January 28th at 1 p.m. ET, we'll speak with Brad Iben, Executive Director of the Masters of Science in Product Management. Product management is close to my heart. I've been a product manager in some companies, and I've been in companies that needed a better product manager. I'm not going to tell you whether there's an overlap there. But product managers play a crucial role in organizations, and Brad will be joined by other recent industry sponsors and a program alum for that. So that's on January 28th. In the meantime, please look us up on cmu.edu/enable, and you'll find more information. You'll find our prior webcasts like this, panels, discussions, roundtables, and so on. And we invite you to become a sponsor. And I would be remiss in not mentioning our current sponsors, which are Progressive and Zendesk, to whom we were very, very grateful. Ken, this was a lot of fun. I think there's even more to talk about here. So I look forward to carrying on. And for those in the audience who wish to carry on, please get in touch with us. I think, is there a closing slide we can show? Maybe it's valuable, maybe not. Otherwise, thanks so much, everyone. We appreciate your time and attention today. Have a wonderful holiday. We'll see you next year. Bye-bye.